This is our second shiur on vayigash, which is a maamar for Hey Tevis, which the rebbe said in Tafshin Chaf Hey, because of technical difficulties and halamas vestadim, things have been delayed. But in Mitzvah Hashem, this week and last week and this week, we put up the two Maamarim for vayigash from the rebbe as part of our new series of Maamarim, which are the Maamarim of the rebbe that are edited, that are mugah. And I'm repeating again, if anybody has an interest in sponsoring such a shiur, we have such sponsorships available, and you're welcome to contact us about your interest in sponsoring these classes. This is a very interesting maamar for a number of reasons. The most obvious and the most basic thing that makes this maamar unique is that this is a maamar that celebrates prayer. It puts tefillah above all else. The highest thing is davening, is prayer. In Chassidus, there's so much discussion about the three pillars, Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim, learning Torah, davening, and doing mitzvahs, which is greater. And we always deal with the complexities and the dualities of it, whether Torah is greater, or tefillah is greater, whether mitzvahs are greater, and so on. This maamar squarely and obviously puts tefillah on a pedestal. Nothing is like prayer. And the maamar argues that prayer is above all else for a number of reasons. First of all, the rebbe proposes, based on the maamar from the Tzemach Tzedek, that there's no such thing as an unanswered prayer. Every prayer is answered. And not only is every prayer answered, but that the answer to every prayer comes down into the physical world. It's only that some prayers retain a helam v'hesed. There's a blockage which does not allow the answer to that prayer, which has come down into the physical world, to be physically visible. But it will be visible when Mashiach comes. There's no such thing as an unanswered prayer, based on how the Anshe Kesas HaGedela wrote the tefillah. That's number one. Number two, when there's a minyan davening, 10 yidden davening, so then the Gemara says, Hein keil kabe lo yimas, God Almighty never ever rejects the prayer of a community, of a tzibur. And then the prayer is not only answered, and the prayer's answer not only comes down physically, but it's actually revealed. The ultimate example for this is when the prayer is not being done by 10 people, but by every Jew in the world. What is an instant when every single Jew in the world is praying? And the answer is when Rebbe commands Rabbi and his sons to daven. Rabbi and his sons are compared to the three of us, and their power of prayer is extraordinary. But they pray every day. What is the reason that the specific day that Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rebbe, gathered them, that they should daven in order to affect Tchias HaMesim, was their prayer more effective? So first of all, they were the minyan. Second of all, they were the chazonim. And third of all, Rebbe commissioned them to pray. And because Rebbe was the leader of the generation, and this is implicit and not explicit, and Hanasihu Hakel, the whole generation is included in Rebbe. So by Rebbe commissioning them to pray, their prayers on behalf of all the Jewish people present. And the Rebbe says further, even Jewish people who knew nothing about that event, when Rebbe commissions Rabbi and his sons to pray, it's like literally every single Jew on the planet is praying at the same time. And then the idea that the prayer has a physical effect that's revealed in this world is in the most complete. So that's the first idea, that every prayer is answered. The second idea is that prayer is human sacrifice. Prayer is about you. You are connecting to Hashem by sacrificing yourself. And the maamar explains it, that when a person raises himself, sacrifices himself in prayer, it's called Ein Sof L'mayla Mayla gets. Pardon me, which means that the godly source of creation is raised up till Atzmos, to the very, very highest levels, as a Jew raises himself to those highest levels. So prayer reaches higher than other things, including Torah. And thirdly, and this is probably the most critical idea of the maamar, is that prayer changes the physical world. When a person davens, a miracle happens. When a person learns Torah and does mitzvahs, it's very meaningful spiritually, but it doesn't have an actual physical changing effect on the physical world. When a person prays for someone who's ill that they should recover, or someone who's poor that they should be able to sustain themselves, so it makes a physical change in the physical world, and that really is the most significant distinction of tefillah, that it actually changes the physical world. Now, of course, how do you make a change in the physical world? The physical world is limited and has its own rules and order. And the answer is that you reach higher than ishtalshalus. When a prayer is a limited prayer, it can only have a limited effect in terms of change. But when a prayer is unlimited, then it has a physical, it physically changes the world. This is more or less a summary of what we learned so far in the Maamar. There are two more things that we need to say about prayer. Two more things we need to say about prayer, in addition to all the things I said so far, that every prayer is answered, that prayer is about the person who raises it up to Atzmas Amhus, and again, most significantly, that prayer changes the world physically. There's two more things that need to be said about prayer. Uba'akdama, I have to preface. God created a world, and it's His. The Mittel Rebbe told somebody once, it's impossible for us to understand the value of Teva. Nature is a creation of God, and every creation of God is valuable to God Almighty. So if He created Teva, Teva is important to Him, and He doesn't just go ahead and break it. The idea that we can break or change nature through prayer is very profound. It means it has to be so powerful that it overrides, that it's stronger than the presence of nature as designed by the Creator and the value and the stock that He has in nature per se. And that's the koyach of tefillah. But there's one thing that the Maamar argued tefillah lacks. There's one thing that the Maamar says tefillah is missing. Prayer works. Prayer reaches Atzmos. Prayer changes the physical world. But when prayer changes the physical world, what you see is a physical change. You don't see the power of God. When a person davens for someone who's ill, and however that davening works, he succeeds, or a group of people succeed, or every Jew in the world together collectively pray and effect a change that this person should recover, what you see is the physical change in the person on this earth. But you don't see how that physical change is an expression of God. You just see the physical change. Now appreciate, understand how Hasidus views it. Think about it. And I believe I talked about this in the last class. The pinnacle of davening, the highest point of davening, is Shemona Esrei. Pardon me. And yet, what do we talk about in Shemona Esrei? Me. I need health, I need parnasa, I need security, I need safety, I need all kinds of things. And of course, the question becomes, when you're in this high level, why are you praying for physical things? And the answer is, when you're in this high level, you're not praying for physical things, you're praying for a connection to God. The proof that that connection with God has occurred is that you see a physical change. That physical change is the evidence of the effectiveness of the prayer. So when a Yid davens for chokhmah, or for tshuva, or for slicha, or for geula, or for refuah, or for parnasa, or whatever the case is, when a Jew davens and his prayers are answered, that physical change in the physical world is the symptom, is the expression of the power of that prayer. Says the Maamar, however, although the world has been changed, a physical thing has occurred, a miracle has happened on the physical world as a consequence of this prayer, which is an expression of the effectiveness of the prayer and God's influence on the world. But you see the physical change, you don't see God's hand. This is what the one downside of prayer is. So the Rebbe in the Maamar is going to address this as well. And let's go about this as follows. Let's go back to Page Kuf Chav Ches, which is Siv Gimel, which is near the beginning of the Maamar. And I want to read with you a few lines. Okay? If you look on Page Kuf Chav Ches, second line from the bottom, he brings what the Gemara says, that before we say Shemona Esrei, we say Hashem sefasai tiftach afi agitei lasach. Right? Translate the words. Hashem, comma, God, pause. It's a direct conversation. Sefasai tiftach, open my lips. And the reason you say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem sefasai tiftach, open my lips, is because the presumption that when you're standing in front of Hashem, you're so bottled, you're so subservient, it can't even speak. And you say to him, Safasai Tiftach, give me the power to speak. Ufiya git hilasecha, and my mouth should speak your praise. So before davening, since you're ka'avda kamei mother, you're as a slave in the presence of his master, you need God's help to actually be able to speak to him. So the Gemara says, she'ein zeh hefsek ben ge'ula l'tefillah. That's not considered an interruption between Birchas Kishma and Shemini Esrei. The Gemara says that kivon that the kinu rabbanon, since it was the Chachamim, the Chazal, who enacted l'meimer ad Hashem sefasai tiftach, to say this prayer, so the Gemara ketfila arichta damya, it's considered part of the Shemini Esrei itself. Top of page Kuf Chav Tes, and here's the key. V'hinei Targum ala pasuk, on this pasuk Hashem sefasai tiftach, as it appears in Tilim, this Targum. And the Targum translates the pasuk ad Hashem sefasai tiftach pirush. These are the words: Sefusei pasach be'erais. Open my lips with Torah. Hashem sefasai tiftach means please open my lips with Torah. Umevu er bekam drushim. And the Maamarim explain. Pardon me. The Torah that explain the interplay, or the interface, and the difference, and the advantages of each, of Torah and Tefillah. Skip the parenthesis, that the request in this passage, in the beginning of one's prayer is, and listen to these words, that when I pray, it should be like Torah. Hashem, I'm davening. And we already know the power of prayer. Every prayer is answered. It's total sacrifice and uplifting to Atzmos. And therefore it has a physical change in the world. But now comes the fourth idea. That when a person davens, it should be like Torah. What does that mean? So the rebbe now continues and he says 4 lines. From the top of the page, when a Jew studies Torah, he's not learning his original thoughts. He's learning the wisdom of God. The words of God that were placed in our lips. And it's explained in Chassidus at the highest level of learning Torah. It's as though God is speaking, and you're simply repeating after Him. There's a notion that in prayer as well, that when a person prays, it's translate that rebbe, that it should be as though God is praying. I'm simply repeating His words. That the way a yid should pray should be that through which it should be brought down. Skip the parenthesis. Tehilasecha translates the rebbe Tfilaseh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God's prayer. Now, of course, God's not praying to Himself. We're davening to the Eibishter. But God prayer means that the power of the prayer that reaches Atzmos Amhus and brings down a shinui should not be ours, as if we're repeating after HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now we're adding a 4th concept to Tefillah, based on Yonis and Ben Azil's in translation, whoever the Targum until him is, on Hashem's Sefasai Tiftach. That we're now saying that now, not only is my davening as potent as it is, but it's as if I'm repeating after HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So now go back all the way to page Kuf Lamed Gimel and read Sif Tes, the second half of page Kuf Lamed Gimel. The Rebbe wants to add a 4th point. The 4th point is this. We understand that there's 2 different things, Torah and Tefillah. Torah is very spiritual. In Torah you see godliness. Tefillah is very real. In Tefillah you see a change in the physical world, but you don't see the godliness. The Rebbe wants to argue that when a person davens, and before he davens, he says, Hashem sefasai tiftach fiyah git tehilasecha, and the translation of those words are that we're as if we are repeating the prayer of Hashem. So the Rebbe says in Siftes as follows: V'hinei Zeshen is the discussion we had before, that even though prayer reaches the highest levels, and it changes the world. I'm skipping one line. I'm sorry, I'm not skipping a line. But the light is not revealed. In other words, in prayer you see a physical change in the physical earth, but you don't see that it's God's. Continues the Rebbe and he says 3 lines into that paragraph. However, there's a notion that a person davens, and the davening has the advantage of Torah as well. In that case, where davening also has the advantage of Torah, When a person davens, and the davening is so effective that it changes the physical world, there's two outstanding things. Number one, the godliness which is brought down is from the highest levels, and therefore makes a physical change in the world. And number two, that you should see that it's God. The third point of the maamar is that davening changes the world, and you see the change in the world, but you don't see that it's God. The fourth point in the maamar is that when the davening has the advantage of Torah also, you not only see a change in the world, but you see the godliness. See how it's a physical change in the world. And the Rebbe says, this is what Hashem said in the next paragraph, which I'm not going to read with you inside. He says this. The addition of Hashem tiftach as a fourth concept of prayer, in addition to the certainty of the answer, in addition to reaching atzmos, in addition to changing the physical world, because we begin the prayer by mentioning Torah, we affect that in addition to all the other wonderful things about tefillah also, besides for changing the physical world, reveals in the world godliness which comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then tefillah has every advantage of Torah. It's equal to Torah, plus its own advantages. This is point 4. What this gives us is that we had a maamar that compared and contrasted learning Torah to tefillah and said, what's the difference? Torah, spirituality, godliness coming into the physical world and into your brain that you could understand within your limitations, and it remains godly. Tefillah is a very powerful thing, but you don't see the godliness, you see the change in the physical world. Now the argument is that in tefillah you also see the godliness. So this fourth idea, that in addition to a person's prayer having a certain effect, and that this certain effect changes the physical world, you also see godliness. The argument is that it makes Torah and tefillah equal. Torah is not advantageous over tefillah at all. There's nothing about Torah superior to tefillah, because when the tefillah has the Hashem sefasai tiftach, not only is there a physical change in the physical world, you see that it's godliness. Now I want you to turn to the very end of the maamar. Kuf lamed dalet, mamish near the end. The last paragraph. And let's begin here. I'm starting on Kuf Lamed Daled, the last paragraph of the maamar, third line in. And the third, it says like this: the Kesher HaTefillah, when a person prays. And of course we already have 4 advantages of prayer. Prayer is for sure answered. Prayer reaches atzmos and you get yourself there. Prayer changes the physical world, and prayer reveals the godliness that had that effect of change. So the Rebbe says like this: the keshat tefillah, when somebody prays, ba'oifen in such a way, sheyesh ba gam ha'mayla de Torah, that it also had the advantage, not just of changing the world, but that you see that the change is coming from godliness. Says Rebbe point 5. Then hatfili lamayla mitayra. This prayer is even higher than Torah, even though the advantage of Torah is that it reveals godliness. And the advantage of tefillah is that it reaches atzmos and changes the physical world. But when in tefillah, you not only reach atzmos and change the physical world, but that you see that it's godly. So when you have both the ma'ila of tefillah and the ma'ila of Torah together, then tefillah becomes higher than Torah. And the Rebbe does not explain why, it doesn't. But I think it's obvious. Because in the end, tefillah changes the physical world. In other words, Torah is amazing. It's an incredible thing. But Torah comes down from heaven to earth. It's a godly, spiritual thing being manifest in the physical world, and appeals to the mind of the person, not to the physical world. Tefillah changes the physical world, which is much lower, pardon me, and has a higher source. If tefillah, in addition to changing the physical world, also reveals its godliness, then it's not only equal to Torah, it's superior to it. And look how the Rebbe speaks it out. And he says like this: right, there's 2 perspectives. One perspective is that you're looking at the world the way God sees it. The other perspective is you're looking at the world the way man sees it. Looking at the world the way God sees it is Torah. Looking at the world the way man sees it is tefillah. Says the Rebbe the following: when the human perspective that there is a world is ba'oifen, exists in such a fashion, shemeir be'gam, that it shines and reveals also that the human being's perspective reveals the divine perspective, and that it's even higher than the godly perspective. When you say there is a world and that this world reveals that there's nothing but God, then that's greater than saying that there's nothing but God and not a world. So when tefillah becomes equal to Torah, it automatically becomes superior to it. And that's the fifth point. Tefillah changes the physical world. Torah reveals godliness in the world. When tefillah changes the physical world and you see in a revealed way that that's godliness, then tefillah is greater than Torah because the revelation of godliness is in a physical thing. And in Torah, the revelation of godliness is only in a spiritual thing. And that's as much as we're going to read on Torah and Tefillah. That's as much as we're going to read on Torah and Tefillah. So, to summarize now, we have five, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, count them, advantages of Tefillah. Number 1, every prayer is answered. Number 2, prayer is you sacrificing yourself, reaching atmos, raising up godly light to the essence. Number 3, it has a physical change in the physical world. Number 4, that since davening also has the advantage of Torah, when you say Hashem Sefasei Tiftach, it reveals the godliness. And number 5, then tefillah is not equal to Torah, it's superior because you're seeing godliness revealed through the physical change in the physical world. Right. This is the Maamar. Okay? Done. Now, we get to the Haskalah and the Siyum. Having explored davening and these 5 points of prayer, which makes prayer equal and opposite to Torah, superior to Torah, having every advantage that Torah has plus, have a relationship with the vayigash of Yehuda. Because go back to the very beginning of the Maamar. Any person who's learned any Chassidus is aware of the meeting of Yosef and Yehuda, vayigash of Yehuda. And you're also aware that the meeting of Yosef and Yehuda is in the Parsha, and it's in the Haftarah also. The Haftarah of Parshas Vayigash has the pasuk Ve'avdi David, the meeting of Yehuda and Yosef. It says in Sfarim, based on Chazal of course, that in the time, I'm assuming the second Beis HaMikdash, maybe later, there was a decree that people were not allowed to learn Chumash. So the Chazal instituted that if you can't learn Chumash, you should read Navi. So every week, instead of reading Bereshis, Noach, Lech Lecha, they would read from the Nevi'im. And of course, the original takana was that they would read 21 psukim, because if you have 7 aliyahs, and each aliyah is a minimum of 3 psukim, so 7 times 3 is 21, and they would say 7 brachas. And there was a period of time that Yidden only said the Navi. And of course, the Gezerah went away, and the Navi was kept. So every Shabbos and Yom Tif, we say Torah, and then we say Haftarah. The Torah is from the Chumash, and Haftarah is from the Nevi'im. And the rule is that what we read in the Navi has to parallel what we read in the Parsha. Now, the Rebbe has siches, there's a particular siche, B'Shalach, Tovshin, Nun Beis, and there were others where the Rebbe makes the point that the difference between the Parsha and the Haftarah is that the Parsha is the story of the Torah in a Geula framework, and the Haftarah is the story of the Parsha in a Golus / Mashiach, how it brings the Mashiach framework. And Parshas Vayigash is no exception. Vayigash begins with Yehuda approaching Yosef. The Haftarah describes Yosef approaching Yehuda. How? Because Haftarah is the Navi Yecheskel. God Almighty is speaking to the Navi Yecheskel, and he's talking to him about what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. And he says, take 2 pieces of wood. On one piece of wood, write Eitz Yehuda. On the other piece of wood, write Eitz Yosef. And these are going to represent the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judea that existed in times of the first temple. Put them together, and they're going to become one. In other words, just like when the Jewish nation was born, they were one nation. And only after Shlomo Melech passed away did it become 2. Yehuda and Yisrael. Yerushalayim and Shemron, as it were. When Mashiach comes, we're going to become one again. But when we become one, when Mashiach comes, it's going to be Eitz Yehuda. There's not going to be 2 kings, there's going to be only one, and it's going to be Yehuda. So the Maamarim Chassidus analyze this and make the following assertion. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is the story of Yosef and Yehuda. The end is Mashiach. And the middle is what happened during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash. In the Chumash, Yehuda and Yosef meets. Who's the king? Yosef is the king. Who is the subordinate? Yehuda. When Mashiach comes, who's the king? Yehuda is the king. Who's the subordinate? Yosef. In the times of the first Beis HaMikdash, they were side by side, they were parallel. And the human history, the Jewish history, the history of Yiddishkeit and Yidden as it plays out over the course of time is a journey from the superiority of Yosef to the superiority of Yehuda. How is it explained? So you bring the Gemara in Kedushin about Rabbi Akiva and Reb Tarfon, about Talmud Gadol and Maisa Gadol. What is greater, learning Torah or doing mitzvahs? And of course the answer is that Gadol, Talmud, Shemevi, the day Maisa, that learning Torah is greater because it teaches you how to do action. And Chassidus says, but when Mashiach comes, we're going to paskin like Reb Tarfon, that Maisa Gadol, action is greater. That means to say, Judaism has two components, a rich, spiritual, meaningful component, and a component that involves submission and conformity. Kabbalah says, you're told what to do and you listen. Yosef represents the richness, the sophistication, the enlightenment of Yiddishkeit. Yehuda represents bittul, hapam oides Hashem. In the beginning of our history, Yosef was superior. We were very sophisticated, we were very intelligent, very enlightened, very rich, very spiritual. But the notion of bittul, of submission, of Kabbalah sale, and the idea that there is more truth in submission was beyond us. So Yosef is the king and Yehuda is the subordinate. That's the meaning. Vayigash, I love Yehuda. Yehuda approaches Yosef. When Mashiach comes, it's a whole other world. The only thing that's left is Eitz Yehuda. Why? Because Mashiach reveals the truth of God. And the truth of God is not in our understanding and our feeling and our sensing and our spirituality. The truth of God is in our submission to Hashem to do mitzvahs practically and physically in this world. In the mitzvahs we did physically, you have what we call in our culture, atzmos amhus. So Mashiach comes, Yehuda, that represents bittul, is going to be superior. In the time of the first Beis HaMikdash, they were side by side. Ephraim, Yosef represented sophistication and richness. Yehuda represented Kabbalah and bittul. Neither could dominate either. So the Maamarim Chassidus and vayigash present more or less what I just said. In the beginning of the Jewish people, Yosef is superior and Yehuda is inferior. In the end of Jewish history, Yehuda is superior and Yosef is inferior. This is written in the Pasha, this is written in the Haftarah. Okay, show you. Like I said, there's so many Maamarim Chassidus that give you this classic insight. There's a famous line of Adi David Tafresh Tzadik Tes. The rebbe repeated it, Kama Pamim, including Tafshin Mem Vav, I think, and Bakama. It's a standard. It's one of those classics. And by the way, even in Teda Eden, Vayigash, Keres Batenu Arazim, which we learn, I think he also speaks a similar idea. I'm speaking from memory, but I think he also speaks the same concept. Our maamar begins where that whole discussion ends. In other words, everything I just said, our maamar just ignores. Our maamar just ignores it all. Completely ignores it. The standard vayigash that we're used to, our maamar doesn't even discuss. The idea that in the beginning Yosef is superior, in the end Yehuda is superior, our maamar doesn't even address any of that thing. Because there's so many maamarim that do it. Our maamar, so to speak, picks up where those maamarim finish. And our maamar is based on several observations. All these observations challenge the introduction that I just gave. Observation number one. The Zohar. The Zohar says that the meeting of Yehuda and Yosef is smichas geula l'tefillah. That in Parshas Vayigash, not in the Haftarah, in Parshas Vayigash, when Yehuda approaches Yosef, that's the joining together of Yosef, of geula and tefillah. What's the problem? The problem is geula is Yosef, tefillah is Yehuda. Now, if geula approaches tefillah, who's superior, Yosef or Yehuda? Yehuda is superior. But in the Parsha, Vayigash Elav Yehuda, Yosef is superior and Yehuda is secondary. So the Zohar says something about the pasuk that's different than what the pasuk says. The pasuk says Yehuda approaches Yosef because it's the beginning of history. In the beginning of history, what matters most is enlightenment and intellect and subordination, and bittul is secondary to that. But the Zohar says, no, you see that passage, the beginning of history, it's Yosef approaching Yehuda. It's geula approaching tefillah. Big problem. The Zohar reads into the pasuk exactly the opposite of what the pasuk says. But there's another observation. And this is from the Tzemach Tzedek. And if you look inside, It's the beginning of the second paragraph at the beginning of the Maamar, page Kuf Chav Zayin. Sif Beis, the first line says, he brings a Maamar from the Tzemach Tzedek that says, Seifei Tevis vayigash elav Yehuda hu shaveh. The first three words, the parashas of Vayigash are vayigash elav Yehuda. The last three letters spell out Shin Vav Hey, shaveh, equal. And the connotation is, Yosef's not higher than Yehuda, Yehuda's not higher than Yosef. So the Zohar places Yehuda above Yosef. The Tzemach Tzedek makes Yosef and Yehuda equal. The Pasuk makes Yosef superior to Yehuda. So our Maamar starts where all the other Maamarim finish and says, how do we resolve all these problems? How do we answer all these questions? And the Rebbe, at the end of Sif Aleph, if you're looking again on page Kuf Chazayt, and the Sif Aleph does something very simple. He says, if you look at the last four lines of the first Sif, it says the following words: Mizeh shagama posuk va'avdi David melech aleim v'haftera de pashas vayigash. The Haftarah describes Yehuda being superior. The Pasha describes Yosef being superior. But it's the Haftarah of the Pasha. In other words, it's not two separate things. The Haftarah qualifies the Pasha. Says the Rebbe, Mashma, this indicates Shebevayigash Eilam Yehuda, that even in the Pasha, where Yehuda is secondary and Yosef is superior, Yesh Negam HaMayla de Yehuda Lagabe Yosef. There's an advantage of Yosef. The only difference is that in the Pasha, although Yehuda has an advantage over Yosef, it's hidden, and you see Yosef's advantage over Yehuda. And in the Haftarah, although Yosef has an advantage over Yehuda, you see the advantage of Yehuda over Yosef. In short, in this Maamar, we challenge the standard understanding of the way these psukim are read. The way these psukim are read is that in the Chumash, Yosef is higher, in the Haftarah, Yehuda is higher. And I brought you three arguments: a Zohar, and the Tzemach Tzedek's commentary of Shaveh, and the fact that the Haftarah is called the Haftarah of the Pasha, which challenged that supposition. So this is where our Maamar begins. Our Maamar begins after all the Maamarim. All Maamarim say Yosef is greater than Yehuda in Giluyim. Yehuda is greater than Yosef in Atzmos. So in the beginning of time when Giluyim was dominant, Yosef was superior. In the end of time when Atzmos was dominant, Yehuda is going to be superior. And the Rebbe says you can't say any of these things, because in the Pasha you already see Yehuda's dominance. In the Haftarah you also see Yosef's dominance. And the word Shaveh throws a wrench into the whole situation. And this becomes the question. You learned all the other Maamarim. And this Maamar says all the other Maamarim that want to separate the beginning of time from the end of time break down. So how do we deal with it all? How do we reconcile the understanding that Yosef is higher than Yehuda in the beginning and Yehuda is higher than Yosef in the end, and the idea that they're all Shaveh? And the answer is our Maamar. What did our Maamar do? Our Maamar juxtaposed, compared and contrasted Tefillah and Torah, and did something that most Maamarim don't do, right? Our Maamar compared and contrasted Tefillah and Torah, and raised Tefillah higher than Torah. Torah's advantage is light. Tefillah's advantage is a miracle and it changes nature. But then we added what? That in addition to Tefillah performing a miracle and changing nature, when a person says Hashem Sefasai Tiftach in the beginning of his Tefillah, that Tefillah has the advantage of Torah as well. So our Maamar is going to say this is the Pshat Shaveh. On one level, Yosef is higher than Yehuda. On the second level, Yehuda is higher than Yosef. On the third level, they're equal. Yosef is not higher than Yehuda, and Yehuda is not higher than Yosef, because in Yehuda you have Yosef, that means in Tefillah you have Gilui, and in Yosef you have Yehuda, that means in Torah you have Tefillah. And therefore, although the simple read of the Maamarim is to say that in the times of Egypt, Yosef, Giluyim, Torah, is higher than Tefillah, Atzmos, Yehuda. And when Mashiach comes, it's going to be the other way around. There's a third level where they're mamish the same. Tefillah is not higher than Torah because it has all the milas of Torah. It makes a change in the physical world, and it reveals godliness, because you say Hashem Sefasai Tiftach. And Torah has the mile of Tefillah because it also reaches the physical world. So let's read Sif Beis. In other words, on page Kuf Chav Zayin, Sif Beis. Let's explain this. Imam Avu, Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek writes The last three letters of the words, the last letter of the first three words, vayigash, Elav, Yehudo, Shava. And what does the Shava means the same? Ke'inyan vayigash Elav Yehudahu, the significance of Yehuda and Yosef meeting is Shah Malchus, which is Yehuda, the idea of kingship and subordination and bittul, which is Yehuda. Vizah, and the idea of revelation and enlightenment and richness and sophistication, Yosef, Shneim Shavim are equal. Not one is higher and one is lower. Not one is higher now and lower later, or higher yesterday and lower today. Shavah. It's a third level. And in order to explain, Yosef and Yehuda can be equal. After all, the Maamarim tell you differently. All Maamarim tell you in the beginning Yosef was superior and in the end Yehuda is superior. Here comes a maamar and makes them shaveh. So in order to explain this, it brings it says in Lukutat in explaining the pasuk lases hayashar ben yad Hashem. There's a concept of serving Hashem on a level which is called yashar. Yashar means to go straight. And he explains the meaning of the word yashar. The inyan yashar hu, the notion of going straight, is a chibur v'ayichud, the union and unifying of das elyon and das tachten. The higher knowledge and the lower knowledge. In other words, yichud elav yichud atah, the higher unity and the lower unity. They're all the same. They should become one. Now, what does this mean? The higher unity and the lower unity. And really, the place that you have to refer to when having this conversation is Shara Yichud V'Amunah, chapter 7, the beginning. There's the great question, and I think we've talked about this in our classes. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, if you really want to consolidate it into a sentence, means there's no world. Bar Hashem Kaved Malchus Elam V'Ad, if you really want to consolidate it into one sentence, means there is a world and God as its master. Now, of course, which is true? Is Shema Yisrael true, that there is no world? Or is Bar Hashem Kaved Malchus Elam V'Ad true, there is a world and God is its master? And of course, frankly, whichever one is true we should say, whichever one is false we shouldn't say. So there's a huge discussion in Hasidus based on the pasuk of Kel Deis Hashem, which means that there are two truths, and they're both part of the Torah, and both part of the divine will and plan, and therefore they're both true. Shema Yisrael is true, there is no world. Baruch Hashem Kaved Mechus Levad is true, there is a world and God as its master. It's called the higher unity and the lower unity. Now, philosophically, the higher unity is greater than the lower unity. Why? The higher unity says all there is God. The lower unity says, well, God doesn't have such full manifestation because there is a world. But there's another side to the coin. What's the other side to the coin? That this world serves God. That this world is a platform for God's purpose to be realized. Or to use an old Chassidic allusion in the name of the Rebbe Marash, that the Yesh HaNivr is Magal, the Yesh HaMiti. In the physical world, you see the truth of God, which is higher than you can see in any spiritual world. That means that when you talk about a higher unity and a lower unity, it's not simple that the higher unity is greater than the lower unity. Logically, the higher unity is greater than the lower unity because it's more one. But religiously, the lower unity is greater than the higher unity because it fulfills a purpose. So Yosef represents the higher unity, there's nothing but God. Yehuda represents the lower unity, there may be a world, but the world is fulfilling the divine purpose. Now, if we would stop right here, we would understand that the higher unity is one perspective. The lower unity is a different perspective, and each has different advantages. The higher unity's advantages, there's nothing but God. The lower unity is that there's a world that serves Him. But they're different. You can't call them Shava. They're different. Each one has an advantage and a disadvantage. So the Rebbe now continues, and he says, Yosef and Yehuda in and of themselves, they're opposites. Yosef is das elyon. Yosef's perspective is godliness. From his point of view, you know what God knows. The world does not exist. That's like Shema Yisrael. And 3 lines from the bottom, Ubi Yehuda Malchus, as opposed to Yehuda Shehu Malmata Lamayla, which was from the bottom to the top. Who das techten Shalamata Yesh Shalamayla Ayin. There is a world, and the world serves God. So, these two perspectives, where Yosef says there's nothing but God, and Yehuda says there is a world that serves God, is consistent with the perspective that says, in the beginning of time, Yosef is superior, in the end of time, Yehuda is superior. But then we come to our maamar that makes it the same, Shava. And the rebbe says, second line from the bottom of page, Kuf Chav Zayin V'in, in vayigash elav Yehuda, the notion of Yehuda approaching Yosef, is hachibur, joining together das elyon v'das tachta, the perspective that there's nothing but God, with the perspective that there is a world that serves him. In other words, this world that serves him, which is separate from him, reveals that there's nothing but God, which is the whole concept of tefillah as Maamar developed it. It changes the physical world and it reveals that there's God. Which explains another medrash ala pasuk vayigash elav Yehuda. Ein vayigash ala lashon shalom. Vayigash means peace. Translates the rebbe not peace because one is superior to the other and the other is subordinate to the first, but rather achib, or the das elyon v'das tachta, the union of the higher knowledge, which is that there's only God, and the lower knowledge, that there is a world which serves him, that they become one. And the rebbe develops this further. And that's what this maamar is about. This maamar says, we all know the vayigash. We've learned a dozen of them. And in those maamarim, we say that Yosef was initially superior and Yehuda inferior. And at the end of time, Yehuda is going to be superior and Yosef is going to be inferior. But there's a third level, where Yosef and Yehuda are equal, where tefillah has all the advantages of Torah and Torah has all the advantages of tefillah. And I'm reading the next paragraph. That means page Kuf Chav Ches, 5 lines from the top. Umizeh, and therefore, move when it's understood. Shabahagashas Yehuda leYosef, when Yehuda approaches Yosef. Now, we're talking about the parsha, not the haftarah. When you read in the Chumash about Yehuda approaching Yosef, so on the surface, b'chitzonius, shebegilei, on the outside, ha'inyan the hagashas Yehuda leYosef, who lefisha Yosef, who amashpia v'Yehuda amakam. On the surface, if Yehuda is approaching Yosef, Yosef is superior and Yehuda is inferior. Which is, of course, how most Maamarim address this dilemma. Now, 3 lines into that paragraph, near the end of the line, but there's another point. And this second point is unique to this maamar. And what's the second point? That B'hagashas Yehuda leYosef, when Yehuda approaches Yosef, Shemerum is b'seifei tevis, which is hinted in the last letters of each of the first 3 words. Vayigash elav Yehuda rasher tevis shava. Yossi is shava. Hu sha'achibur, that the union, vayichad, and the oneness of Yosef v'Yehuda sheyeh la'asad la v'shamachas tiyah kameza, that machas are equal. So you read it like this. The Pasha says Yosef is higher than Yehuda. The haftarah says Yehuda is higher than Yosef. And the Pasha says Yosef and Yehuda are equal. And when the Pasha is saying Yosef, Yehuda are equal, that's not only higher than though it says the first time that Yosef is superior and Yehuda is inferior, but it's even higher than the haftarah that says which Yehuda is superior, Yosef is inferior. So the way you would understand it in terms of chronology would be this. In the beginning of time, Yosef is higher than Yehuda. In the end of time, Yehuda is higher than Yosef. Later still, Yehuda and Yosef are going to be equal, because in Yehuda you're going to have the mile of Yosef as well. And then this third idea, that Yehuda and Yosef are going to be equal, is hinted in the Parsha, in the words of the Zohar, that Agashas Yehuda smichas gul tefillah. In the words of the Tzemach Tzedek, that vayigash el Yehuda sefer tevis shava, and the idea that the haftarah is the haftarah of the Parsha, which makes Yehuda superior. So we have 2 levels of vayigash, which we know from the earlier Maamarim, and a 3rd level of vayigash, which we know from our Maamar. And the 3rd level of vayigash, which we know from our Maamar, says that before the haftarah, before Mashiach, from the beginning of time, there's a notion of Yosef and Yehuda being equal when the davener reveals godliness, and the one who reveals godliness davens. Okay? Now, I must be candid with you. If the Maamar would finish here, we could all agree that it's complicated enough. But now the Rebbe adds a 4th idea. And the 4th idea really is confusing. And I guess the easiest way to clarify the confusion, to be clear what you're not clear about, is to do it this way. Let's arrange it as a chronological thing, time-wise. If we're going to arrange it as a chronological thing, the beginning of the time Yosef is superior, later in time Yehuda is superior, and even later in time Yosef and Yehuda are equal. Now, Kuf Chav Ches, 2nd paragraph, 3 lines from the end. At the end of the line, Vapiza Yesh Lema. I want to add a fourth level, says the Rebbe. And what's the fourth level? Vayigash Elav Yehuda. When Yehuda approaches Yosef, and we understand that Yehuda is approaching Yosef doesn't only mean that Yehuda is inferior and Yosef is superior, but that hinted in these words also was the notion of Shava, that Yehuda and Yosef are equal. There's a third idea. And what's this third idea? Merumiz gam holiyah de malchus. It hints at the ascent, the raising up of malchus, which is sheyihyeh la'asad lavi, which is going to happen when Mashiach comes. Shahamalchus tihyeh la'mayla mizah, that malchus will be higher than Zeir Anpin. Eishes chayla teres bayla. And he finishes with these words, shalamayla gam ha'inyan d'shneim shavim, which is higher than the idea that they're both equal. So we have a fourth level. Level 1 is Yosef is higher. Level 2 is Yehuda is higher. Level 3 is equal. And level 4, Yehuda is higher. But level 4, the Yehuda is higher, is not higher than Yosef. It's higher than the level where Yosef and Yehuda are equal. On what level are Yosef and Yehuda equal? Where Yehuda changes nature and you see that as godliness. And Yosef reveals godliness and it changes nature. The fourth level is that beyond the idea that Yosef and Yehuda are equal. Vayigash is Sefer Tevis Shav. That davening makes a physical change in the world. And when you say Hashem Sefasat Tevdechat reveals godliness, there's the fourth madrega. And the fourth madrega is that tefillah is higher than Torah. And this is how our maamar finished. This is how our maamar finished. And the pshat is that tefillah is equal to Torah. Tefillah reveals godliness. Torah reveals godliness. Tefillah makes a change in this world, and l'chayra Torah makes a change in the world as well. But in the final analysis, Tefillah is higher than Torah. Yehuda is higher than Yosef because it extends lower. Since Tefillah touches physical things, since Yehuda is a Kabal Zel to physical things, the involvement in physical things makes Yehuda not equal to Yosef, but superior to him. So here's how I want you to come away from this class. Two things. Number one, the maamar has a body. And the body of the maamar is about the superiority of tefillah, which for the most part we learned in the last year. Number two, it's a standard maamar of a yigash with a very novel commentary. The standard commentary is, in the beginning Yosef is higher, and Yehuda is higher, and our maamar begins after all of those maamarim saying Yosef and Yehuda are equal. And it finishes by saying when Yosef and Yehuda are equal, ultimately Yehuda is higher because he's reaching lower. And that's the class.
Why don't we see a koch in Zman Tefillah?
Chabad. You know, the Rebbe would very often cite the Alter Rebbe, who was asked similar questions about Chassidim. And the Alter Rebbe used to say that there are certain cases where it's impossible to judge something by itself. If Chassidim do this particular thing, like in this case, they daven late, they're not kiyum on tefillah. And by the way, this is not unique Chabad. All Chassidim are not particular about, they're very careful about Zman Krishma, but not about Zman Tefillah. And by the way, in one of the early Peilishas Svarim, from maybe the Kozhen Magid or the Chayze, it says something much more radical than any Chabad has ever said. That the Baal Shem Tov simply removed all Zman. There's no Zman of mitzvahs. Do mitzvahs anytime you want. I saw it inside, and it was shown to me by actually a Litvak, who was trying to defend Hasidus, who says it says in Peilishas Svarim that the Baal Shem Tov completely removed the Inyan Azman, but this is not what's on the table. It's a very good question, because it's a violation of halach. It says in Shulchan Aruch, you have to daven before a certain time, and of course, if you're davening late, the question becomes whether you're altogether allowed to daven, particularly Psukei de Zimra, and maybe even Birchas Kriyas Shema. So the Alter Rebbe used to say that sometimes when you can't identify whether something is good and bad, see where it leads. And it's true. Chassidim are not particular about Zman Tefillah, but it makes them Chassidim. The result of this is that they're more frum, and they're more alive, and they're more in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there is a halachic answer to the question. There's a technical halachic answer to the question of tefillah. But beyond the answer to, quote, what's the justification, end quote, for davening late, there is the teitzah. What comes from it? What comes from it is that Chassidim daven. And davening takes on a greater meaning than simply paying a bill. It's a responsibility that you have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which creates a bond between you and HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you see in the whole way of life of a chassid, that his whole reality is Teirav Avodah. So this is a very important part of it, to look beyond the tefillah in order to understand the merits of the tefillah. Now there are letters from the rebbe on this, and the situation is as follows. There is no justification for davening late. If a person gets up in the morning and daven, he should daven on time. He should daven in a shul, he should daven with a minyan. There's no heter to daven 2 o'clock in the afternoon because I'm a chassid. There's no such heter. But if the davening late has to do with chasidus, meaning preparation for davening, and kavanas atfila, that you want to be more present when you daven, and therefore you need to have more time to prepare. So then the priority becomes the spirit of tefillah rather than the techno tefillah. It's more important that the davening should connect you to Hashem than you should daven on the clock. And this is basically the explanation for why Hasidim daven late, or they start on time and they finish late, they don't daven with a minyan, and so on. I saw a letter from the rebbe, which he wrote to somebody who struggled with it because he wanted to daven like a chassid, he wanted to daven with a minyan. So the rebbe told him it's a minig mikadmas, no, it's been around by Hasidim for a very long time. Start hoidu with the tzibur, start the beginning of tefillah with the tzibur, and then take it as long as you need. You try to daven with the minyan, and in effect you cannot daven with the minyan. And that's the concept of davening late, that's the concept of davening long, that it creates a possibility for davening to be more than a debt of words and pages, and instead it becomes an obligation and a connection, a bond between the Yid and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which you can't always do on a schedule. You do when you're able to. There's the classic story with Rabbi Eiger. Rabbi Eiger was the son of Rabbi Shlomo Eiger and the grandson of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was not a misnagid. The misnagdim like to paint him a misnagid, and it's simply false. The Mittel Rebbe met him, and he treated the Mittel Rebbe with great derech eretz. Says Igros Chedesh, the Mittel Rebbe describing his meeting and so on. But Rabbi Eiger was absolutely a misnagid. He was a very strong critic of Chassidus. He was very outspoken. He was a very big god. But Rabbi Shlomo Eiger was a Chassidish Yid. Rabbi Shlomo Eiger was a Talmud of the Kotzker and of the Ishbitzer, and became a Rebbe himself. So the grandson, Rabbi Shlomo Eiger, was ostracized by his father, Rabbi Eiger, when he became a chassid. Now Rabbi Akiva Eiger was still alive. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger knew that his grandson was no Rasha, because he raised him. He was madrich him, he was machanech him, and he knew that his grandson was a ben Teira, and a Talmud Chacham, and a Shamayim, and a chassid, and so on. So he told his son, Rabbi Eiger, that he's being goyze b'gzeiras kibadav. He's insisting, as part of the obligation that a son has to honor his father, that he should invite his son for Shabbos. They should spend the Shabbos together. So Rabbi Eiger, against his better judgment and in honoring his father, invited his son. Rabbi Shlomo Eiger, the father, invited his son for Shabbos based on the command of the Zayd. So Rabbi Eiger sent his father a letter saying, listen, I know you have issues with me. If I come for Shabbos, the world is going to melt. It's going to be terrible. Let me come on a Tuesday. Tuesday I'm a little bit more normal. Shabbos, it's terrible. So Rabbi Shlomo Eiger wrote to his son, I really would have nothing to do with you. It's simply Gzeiras Kibbud Avayim. So he said Shabbos, it's Shabbos. Anyway, the story goes that Rabbi Eiger for Shabbos, and of course you understand yourself what happened. He came to Shul Friday night, and Allah Davna and Maidiv, and Rabbi Eiger is pacing the room. Shalach Yadim Ben Acher. You remove yourself from Elam Hazeh. You involve yourself in Ruchnias. And you say to yourself, how can I be Makabel Shabbos? How can I go into a world of holiness and connect HaKadosh Baruch? And all night he paces the shul thinking to himself how he's going to be Makabel Shabbos. He finally finishes Maidav. He comes home 6, 7 in the morning for Kiddush. His father, Shlomo Eiger had waited for him and then couldn't wait anymore, and he made Kiddush and he ate the meal and he sat and learned and he went to sleep. And Rabbi Eiger came home in the morning, he made Kiddush, he ate for about 5 minutes, he benched, he lay down for a little bit and ran to Shul for Shachris. And Shachris for the same story, he finished Shachris was after Shabbos. The bottom line is he made Havdalah at 9 o'clock Sunday morning. So the father says to his son, listen, I know you're a chassid, I know chassidim are no good. But the no good is echadashir. How do you make Havdalah Sunday morning? How do you daven mincha in the middle of the night? How do you eat shalashudas after the sun went down on Motzei Shabbos? So the Rebbe Ege said to his father, the Shlomo Ege says, Gloib mich tate. Ich di nicht te zien, nicht te levun, ich di nor the Rebbeinu Shalom Alein. I worship neither the sun nor the moon. I worship God Almighty Himself. In other words, I don't look at the clock. This is the word. And this is the real significance of Chassidim davening late. Now I want to tell you something. There are other Chassidim, like Ger, that used to daven long, and the Gerer Rebbes saw what we call in our culture a Baal Pe'er, the abuse, and they canceled it, daven with a minyan. And Gerer Chassidim no longer behave like the old Kotzker, where they daven all day, daven with a minyan. The Rebbe could have done the same thing. The Rebbe could have said, you know what, there's a Baal Pe'er element, people are davening late, there's no justification, everyone davens with a minyan, everyone davens on a clock and finished. And we would adhere to it. He didn't do it. And he did not do it because he neglected it. He didn't do it because he didn't want to change it. He didn't do it because he felt that the yotsi hefseidei b'schare, the idea that by Chassidim Chabad, there is a real notion of Chassidim davening, and as a consequence, they daven late or they daven long and so on, they learn Chassidus and so on and so forth. There is a Baal Pe'er element, there is an element of abuse. I'm not going to say it's not there, because I'd be a liar if I said it wasn't. But first of all, the people who are abusing it are at least davening, as opposed to not davening. And the halachic issues are issues, but the bottom line is they're davening. I like to say, maybe they're not davening shachas, but they're davening. And it preserves, for those Chassidim, who have a shaykhis to pnimius, this tradition of arichas atfilah, and that davening should be much more than asking for needs or paying lip service, but actually connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's, in my opinion, the fact that the Rebbe did not change it is because the Rebbe wants it. And everybody who has a shaykhis to it has to be oisig according to their madrege in arichas atfilah.